The leather strap snapped with a crack that echoed across the Missouri River bottomlands. 47 pounds of beaver pelt spilled into the mud as the pack mule stumbled, its rigging torn and useless. The mountain man watched his winter's work scatter across the ground, knowing that without proper equipment to carry those pelts, the 6-month journey he'd just completed meant nothing. What he couldn't know in that moment was that his frustration with failing equipment would lead him to create something that would revolutionize how men carried supplies across the American frontier. The solution he would develop over the next 3 years wouldn't just fix a problem. It would transform the logistics of Western expansion, enable expeditions that had been considered impossible, and become so essential to frontier life that no serious trapper, trader, or explorer would head into the mountains without one. This is the story of Gideon Harker, a mountain man whose name appears in few history books, but whose invention changed the American West. It's a story of practical innovation born from necessity, of stubborn determination to solve a problem everyone else had simply accepted, and of how one man's refusal to settle for inadequate equipment created a tool that would be used for the next 100 years. The problem Gideon Harker faced in the spring of 1832 was one that every man who ventured into the Rocky Mountains knew intimately. The equipment available for packing supplies and transporting furs was barely adequate and frequently failed at the worst possible moments. Traditional pack saddles, adapted from designs used in settled regions, simply couldn't handle the extreme conditions of mountain travel. They broke under heavy loads. They shifted during river crossings. They rubbed sores on animals' backs during long journeys. And most critically, they wasted valuable carrying capacity through poor design and inefficient load distribution. The American fur trade by 1832 was reaching its peak. Tens of thousands of beaver pelts flowed out of the Rocky Mountains each year, carried on the backs of mules and horses over hundreds of miles of brutal terrain. The men who trapped those beavers and transported those pelts were engaged in what historians would later recognize as one of the most difficult commercial enterprises in American history. They traveled for months through unmapped wilderness, crossing mountain ranges, fording rivers, and enduring weather that ranged from desert heat to mountain blizzards. Their survival and success depended entirely on their equipment, and the weakest link in their equipment was how they carried their goods. Gideon Harker understood this problem better than most. He had been working the beaver streams of the Central Rockies since 1826, when he was just 19 years old. Born in western Pennsylvania in 1807, he had grown up hearing stories of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the opportunities waiting in the mountains. When he was old enough, he signed on with William Ashley's Fur Company and headed west into a world that would test every skill he possessed. Those first years taught Harker the realities of mountain life. The romantic vision of trapping beaver in pristine wilderness collided with the harsh truth of equipment failure, dangerous river crossings, encounters with hostile tribes, and the constant challenge of transporting supplies and furs across terrain that destroyed gear and exhausted animals. By 1830, Harker had become an experienced mountain man, but he had also become increasingly frustrated with the limitations of standard packing equipment. The pack saddles used throughout the fur trade were essentially modified versions of sawbuck or crossbuck designs that had been used for centuries. 2 wooden crosspieces formed an X shape on each side, connected by a central frame that sat on the animal's back. Loads were tied to the crosspieces, theoretically balanced on each side. But the design had fundamental problems that became obvious under frontier conditions. First, the wooden frames were heavy. A pack saddle alone could weigh 30 to 40 pounds before any cargo was added. This dead weight reduced the useful load capacity significantly. Second, the rigid wooden construction couldn't conform to different animals' backs. A saddle that fit one mule poorly might fit another mule worse. Third, the design concentrated weight on specific pressure points rather than distributing load evenly across the animal's back. This caused sores and injuries that could cripple an animal within days. Fourth, the method of securing loads to the crosspieces was time-consuming and required considerable skill. An improperly balanced load would shift during travel, creating dangerous instability. But perhaps most critically, the standard pack saddle design simply didn't accommodate the awkward, bulky items that mountain men needed to transport. Beaver pelts pressed into 60-pound bundles were manageable. But what about traps? What about camp equipment? What about the irregular loads of supplies needed for extended expeditions? The rigid crossbuck design forced everything to be packed in ways that wasted space and created unstable loads. Every mountain man dealt with these problems. They were simply accepted as unavoidable challenges of the trade. Men learned to pack carefully, to pad their animals' backs, to check and recheck their rigging. They lost time every morning breaking camp, every evening making camp, and periodically throughout each day when loads shifted and needed readjustment. They lost animals when poor weight distribution caused injuries. They lost supplies when inadequate rigging failed during river crossings. And they lost opportunities when the limitations of their packing equipment prevented them from carrying sufficient supplies for longer expeditions. Gideon Harker experienced all of these problems, but he was unusual in refusing to accept them as inevitable. Throughout the winter of 1831-1832, while trapping beaver along the Green River in present-day Wyoming, Harker thought about pack saddles. He sketched designs in his journal by firelight. He experimented with different ways of distributing weight. He talked with other trappers about what features would be most useful. And slowly an idea began to form. What Harker envisioned was revolutionary in its departure from traditional thinking. Instead of starting with a rigid wooden frame and trying to attach loads to it, he would start with the loads themselves and design a system that could efficiently carry irregular, awkwardly shaped items. Instead of concentrating weight on rigid crosspieces, he would distribute load evenly across the animal's entire back. Instead of using heavy wooden construction, he would use lighter materials that could conform to different animals. And instead of requiring complex rigging that took skilled hands to properly arrange, he would create a system simple enough that even an inexperienced man could pack quickly and securely. The concept was elegant, but execution would prove challenging. Harker spent the spring of 1832 at the annual Rendezvous, the great trading gathering where mountain men met with supply trains from St. Louis. That year's rendezvous was held in Pierre's Hole, a valley near present-day Driggs, Idaho. Hundreds of trappers gathered to trade their furs for supplies, drink, gamble, and share stories from the previous year. Harker used the time to gather materials and begin building his first prototype. He started with leather. Good, thick buffalo hide that could be cut, shaped, and sewn into strong, flexible components. He obtained brass rings and buckles from the supply wagons. He carefully selected and cut pieces of wood that would serve as lightweight structural elements. And then, working methodically over several weeks, he built something that no one at the rendezvous had seen before. The design Harker created would later be called the Harker aparejo, using the Spanish word for pack saddle. The core innovation was a flexible pad system that conformed to the animal's back while distributing weight evenly. Rather than rigid wooden crosspieces, Harker used carefully shaped leather panniers, large pouches that hung on each side of the animal. These panniers were connected by a wide leather pad that sat on the animal's back, spreading weight across a much larger area than traditional saddles. The leather construction meant the entire system could flex and move with the animal's gait, reducing friction and preventing sores. But the real genius was in how loads were secured. Harker designed an integrated rigging system that used adjustable leather straps and brass rings to create a self-balancing mechanism. Loads placed in the panniers automatically settled into optimal positions. Additional gear could be strapped on top using a system of loops and ties that were simple to use but incredibly secure. The entire packing process that might take 30 minutes with a traditional sawbuck saddle could be accomplished in less than 10 minutes with Harker's design, even by relatively inexperienced hands. When Harker demonstrated his prototype at the 1832 rendezvous, the initial reaction was skepticism. Mountain men were conservative about equipment. They trusted what they knew worked, even if it didn't work particularly well. Leather pack saddles seemed flimsy compared to solid wooden construction. The unfamiliar design looked complicated. And Harker was asking men to spend money on experimental equipment when they could get traditional pack saddles from the supply wagons. But Harker had anticipated this resistance. He offered to let skeptical trappers use his prototype for free. He would pack their mules using his system, and they could judge the results after a day's travel. Several men accepted the challenge, expecting the contraption to fail and prove traditional methods superior. What happened instead was a demonstration of superior performance that couldn't be argued with. The mules packed with Harker's aparejo moved more easily and showed no signs of back strain even after a full day carrying heavy loads. The loads remained stable and balanced without the constant adjustment traditional pack saddles required. And when evening came and it was time to unpack, the process was dramatically faster than with conventional equipment. Word spread quickly through the rendezvous camp. By the end of the gathering, Harker had received orders for 20 aparejo sets. He had neither the materials nor the time to fulfill those orders immediately, but he recognized that he had created something valuable. The question was whether he could scale up production and whether the design would prove itself beyond the initial trials. The winter of 1832-1833 found Harker working not on his trapline, but in a crude workshop he established near the junction of the Green and Colorado rivers. He had partnered with a Shoshone woman named Red Willow Woman, whose expertise in leatherworking far exceeded his own. Together they refined the aparejo design, improving the pattern for the panniers, reinforcing stress points, and developing more efficient construction methods. Red Willow Woman's contributions were essential to making the aparejo practical for production. She understood how to cut leather to minimize waste while maximizing strength. She knew which sinew made the strongest stitching and how to waterproof seams using a mixture of beeswax and tallow. She improved Harker's original design by adding features that made the aparejo more durable and easier to maintain. Her name appears nowhere in historical records related to the aparejo's development, but without her expertise, Harker's concept would likely have remained an interesting prototype rather than becoming a widely adopted tool. By the spring of 1833, Harker and Red Willow Woman had completed 15 aparejos. At that year's rendezvous, held on the Green River near present-day Daniel, Wyoming, those 15 sets sold immediately. More importantly, trappers who had used the aparejos Harker made the previous year returned with enthusiastic reports. The equipment had performed flawlessly through a full season of hard use. Animals packed with aparejos had fewer back injuries. Loads had remained secure through difficult river crossings. The time savings in packing and unpacking added up to hours saved each week, which over a full trapping season meant days of additional productive time. The feedback also revealed areas for improvement. Some trappers wanted larger panniers for carrying bulkier items. Others suggested modifications to make the rigging system work better with specific types of loads. Harker took notes, made adjustments, and continued refining the design. By 1834, the Harker aparejo had evolved into its mature form, a configuration that would remain essentially unchanged for the next 50 years. The mature aparejo design consisted of several integrated components. The foundation was a thick leather pad, roughly rectangular, that sat directly on the animal's back over a folded blanket. This pad was stuffed with deer hair or dried grass to provide cushioning while maintaining enough firmness to distribute weight. Attached to each side of this pad were the panniers, large leather pouches reinforced with light wooden frames at their openings to prevent collapse. These panniers could carry 60 to 80 pounds each, depending on size. The rigging system was brilliantly simple. A broad leather strap called the cinch passed under the animal's belly and connected to both sides of the pad using brass rings that allowed some movement and adjustment. This cinch distributed the load-bearing tension evenly rather than concentrating it at specific points. Additional straps called breeching and breast collars ran behind and in front of the animal respectively, preventing the aparejo from sliding backward or forward during travel on steep terrain. The top of the aparejo featured an integrated system for securing additional loads. Crossed leather straps created a cradle where bulky items could be placed and tied down quickly. The whole rigging system used a limited number of knot types, all simple enough for men with cold fingers or limited experience to execute reliably. Once a trapper learned the system, he could pack a mule with full load in under 10 minutes, and that load would remain secure and balanced throughout a day's travel. The performance advantages were measurable and significant. A traditional sawbuck pack saddle weighed 35 to 40 pounds empty. Harker's aparejo weighed 20 to 25 pounds. This difference meant 10 to 15 additional pounds of useful carrying capacity per animal. Over a string of 6 pack animals, this added up to an extra 60 to 90 pounds of supplies or furs that could be transported without adding animals to the train. The improved weight distribution reduced back injuries dramatically. Trappers using aparejos reported that their animals remained sound and healthy through seasons that would have crippled animals using traditional pack saddles. This reliability meant fewer animals lost to injury, which directly improved the economics of mountain operations. A replacement pack mule in the mountains might cost $60 to $80 when one could even be obtained. Preventing injuries through better equipment was far more economical than replacing injured animals. The time savings were perhaps even more significant than the weight advantages. A mountain man's day was constrained by available daylight. Time spent packing and unpacking was time not spent trapping, hunting, or traveling. By reducing packing time from 30 minutes to 10 minutes twice per day, the aparejo gave trappers 40 minutes of additional useful time daily. Over a 6-month trapping season, this accumulated to more than 200 hours, effectively adding 2 extra weeks of productive time to each season. But beyond these measurable advantages, the aparejo enabled types of expeditions that had been impractical or impossible with traditional packing equipment. The ability to carry awkward, irregular loads meant that trappers could bring equipment and supplies that wouldn't fit efficiently on sawbuck saddles. The reliability of the rigging meant that dangerous river crossings became less hazardous. The ease of packing meant that smaller parties with less experienced members could undertake journeys that previously would have required more men or greater expertise. By 1835, the Harker aparejo had become standard equipment throughout the Central Rocky Mountain fur trade. Trappers working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the American Fur Company, and the various smaller operations all used aparejos. Free trappers, men who worked independently rather than for large companies, particularly valued the aparejo because it allowed them to operate with smaller outfits while maintaining carrying capacity comparable to larger organized parties. The adoption wasn't limited to the beaver trade. Military expeditions began using aparejos. The U.S. Army's topographical engineers, tasked with mapping the Western Territories, discovered that aparejos were far superior to military pack saddles for carrying surveying equipment over mountain terrain. Lieutenant John C. Fremont's famous expeditions of the 1840s, which would help open the Oregon Trail and map routes to California, relied heavily on aparejos for packing supplies. Traders and merchants moving goods along the Santa Fe Trail and other overland routes adopted the aparejo for carrying valuable cargo. The design proved especially useful for transporting items that couldn't be easily packed in standardized loads. Medical supplies, tools, books, and other irregular items that had been challenging to pack on traditional saddles fit efficiently into aparejo panniers. Gideon Harker himself continued working as a mountain man through the late 1830s, even as the beaver trade declined due to changing fashion trends that reduced demand for beaver felt hats. By 1840, the era of the Rocky Mountain fur trade was effectively over. Beaver populations were depleted, prices had collapsed, and the mountain men who had lived in the wilderness for decades were forced to find new occupations. Harker made the transition by turning his attention fully to manufacturing aparejos. He established a more permanent workshop near Fort Laramie on the North Platte River in present-day Wyoming. This location gave him access to passing emigrants on the Oregon Trail, military expeditions, and trading parties, all of whom needed reliable packing equipment. Red Willow Woman continued working with him, training other craftspeople in the construction techniques that made aparejos reliable. The business was modestly successful, but never made Harker wealthy. An aparejo sold for $12 to $15, a price that was competitive with traditional pack saddles, but didn't provide enormous profit margins given the labor involved in construction. Harker employed several craftspeople, mostly Native American women whose leatherworking skills were essential to quality production, but the enterprise remained small-scale. What Harker had created, though, was something more significant than personal wealth. The aparejo became a fundamental tool of Western expansion. As emigrants poured across the plains toward Oregon and California in the 1840s and 1850s, aparejos packed their supplies. When the U.S. Army conducted campaigns during the Mexican-American War and later Indian Wars, aparejos carried military equipment. When miners rushed to California after gold was discovered in 1848, aparejos transported their tools and supplies into remote mountain districts. When the first transcontinental surveys were conducted to plan railroad routes, aparejos carried the surveyors' instruments. The U.S. Army officially adopted a standardized aparejo design in 1858, based heavily on Harker's pattern but modified slightly for military requirements. This military aparejo became standard issue for the Army's pack trains and remained in use well into the 20th century. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, 60 years after Harker first built his prototype, American forces still used aparejos descended directly from his design. The construction principles Harker pioneered influenced packing equipment development globally. British forces operating in mountainous regions of India and Africa adopted aparejo-style designs. Spanish colonial forces in the Philippines used aparejos. The basic concept of flexible, conforming panniers connected by a weight-distributing pad became recognized as superior to rigid wooden pack saddles for difficult terrain. Yet Gideon Harker's name remained relatively obscure. He never patented his design. Patent law in the 1830s was complex and expensive, and Harker was a practical man more interested in building useful equipment than protecting intellectual property rights. This meant that anyone could copy his design, which they did extensively. Numerous craftspeople manufactured aparejos based on Harker's pattern, and he received no royalties from their sales. Historical recognition was similarly limited. The aparejos that became standard equipment were often simply called aparejos, without reference to Harker's role in their development. Military records noted the adoption of aparejos, but rarely mentioned their origins. The equipment was simply there, performing its function so reliably that it became invisible in the way that excellent tools often do. Harker spent his later years at Fort Laramie, where he had become a respected figure among the mixed community of trappers, traders, soldiers, and emigrants. He married Red Willow Woman in a formal ceremony in 1845, acknowledging publicly what had been a working partnership and personal relationship for more than a decade. They raised 2 children, a son named William and a daughter named Sarah, both of whom learned the aparejo-making trade. By the 1860s, Harker had largely retired from active manufacturing, though his workshop continued operating under his son's management. He spent time telling stories to younger men who had never seen the mountain fur trade in its prime, describing a world that had existed just 30 years earlier, but already seemed ancient and remote. He died in 1871 at age 64, buried in the military cemetery at Fort Laramie with a simple marker that identified him as Gideon Harker, Mountain Man. The obituary published in the Cheyenne newspaper was brief, noting his death and mentioning in passing that he had invented an improved pack saddle used throughout the West. There was no detailed description of how his invention had transformed frontier logistics. No analysis of its impact on Western expansion. Just a simple acknowledgement that a man had died who had once made something useful. But the aparejos continued their work. Through the 1870s and 1880s, as railroads spread across the West and reduced the need for pack trains on major routes, aparejos remained essential for accessing remote areas. Mining camps deep in mountain valleys, isolated military posts, scientific expeditions, and survey parties all relied on aparejos. The equipment that Harker had designed to carry beaver pelts out of the Rockies was now carrying ore samples, military supplies, and scientific instruments into regions that were still accessible only by pack animal. The technical evolution of the aparejo after Harker's death included various refinements. Manufacturers experimented with different padding materials, improved the brass hardware, and developed specialized versions for particular applications. But the fundamental design remained Harker's. Flexible leather construction, conforming to the animal's back, distributing weight evenly, with integrated panniers and simple rigging. The pattern he had established in 1832 proved so sound that it needed little modification, even as materials and manufacturing techniques improved. The U.S. Army continued using aparejos well into the 20th century. During the punitive expedition of 1916-1917, when American forces pursued Pancho Villa into Mexico, aparejos carried supplies for troops operating in rugged terrain where vehicles couldn't travel. During World War I, aparejos were used in mountain warfare in Italy and the Balkans. As late as World War II, specialized units still employed aparejos for operations in mountainous regions. The last regular military use of aparejos in the U.S. Army occurred in the 1950s when mountain infantry units trained for potential operations in Korea employed pack trains using aparejos based on Harker's design. By then, helicopters and other aircraft were beginning to replace pack animals for supply in rough terrain. But in 1950s, Harker's invention was still performing the function for which he had designed it 120 years earlier. The story of Gideon Harker and his aparejo illustrates several truths about innovation on the American frontier. First, the most important innovations often came from practitioners, not theorists. Harker wasn't an engineer or an inventor by trade. He was a working mountain man who saw a problem and solved it through practical experimentation and craftsmanship. The innovation emerged from intimate understanding of the problem and willingness to question accepted methods. Second, successful frontier innovation required collaboration across cultural boundaries. Harker's concept wouldn't have succeeded without Red Willow Woman's leatherworking expertise and the skills of other Native American craftspeople who turned the design into reliable equipment. The frontier was a meeting place of different traditions and knowledge systems, and practical innovation drew from multiple sources. Third, the most valuable innovations aren't always those that make their creators famous or wealthy. Harker never became rich from his invention. His name was largely forgotten. But his aparejo influenced Western expansion more profoundly than many celebrated inventions. It was the type of fundamental enabling technology that makes other achievements possible. Emigrants reached Oregon partly because aparejos carried their supplies. Scientific surveys mapped the West partly because aparejos carried the instruments. Military campaigns succeeded partly because aparejos kept soldiers supplied. The technology was so fundamental that it became invisible. Finally, Harker's story shows that solving practical problems well requires patience, testing, and willingness to learn from failure. His first prototype was rough. His second-generation design incorporated lessons from field use. His mature aparejo reflected years of refinement based on feedback from users. The innovation wasn't a sudden flash of genius, but rather steady improvement driven by practical experience and careful attention to how the equipment performed in real conditions. The legacy of the Harker aparejo extends beyond the physical equipment. The design principles Harker pioneered, distributing weight evenly, using flexible materials that conform to complex shapes, creating simple rigging that minimizes user error, optimizing for field conditions rather than manufacturing convenience, influenced packing equipment development broadly. Modern backpacking gear, military load-bearing equipment, and commercial packing systems all reflect principles that Harker applied to solving the problem of transporting irregular loads across difficult terrain. In historical terms, the aparejo represents one of thousands of incremental innovations that collectively enabled Western expansion. It wasn't dramatic like the telegraph or transcontinental railroad. It didn't capture public imagination like the Colt revolver or the steel plow. But it was essential. Without reliable means of transporting supplies into remote regions, settlement would have proceeded differently and more slowly. The aparejo wasn't sufficient to cause Western expansion, but it was necessary to enable it. Today, aparejos are museum pieces, displayed in collections focused on Western history and frontier life. Modern pack saddles use synthetic materials and incorporate innovations that Harker couldn't have imagined. But many still follow the basic architectural principles he established. When contemporary packers discuss proper load distribution, balanced panniers, and conforming pad systems, they're applying knowledge that Harker codified nearly 2 centuries ago. The few historical markers that mention Gideon Harker note him as a mountain man and fur trapper, sometimes mentioning his role in developing the aparejo as an aside. There's no national monument to his innovation, no dramatic story of how he changed history. Just the quiet record of a man who saw a problem, developed a solution, refined it through practical testing, and shared it with others who needed it. That understated legacy may be the most appropriate monument to Harker's achievement. He was a practical man who built practical equipment for practical purposes. The aparejo worked. It worked so well that it became standard equipment, so reliable that it faded into the background of frontier life, so fundamental that its origins were forgotten even as the equipment remained in use. The leather strap that snapped in 1832, spilling beaver pelts into Missouri River mud, triggered a chain of development that would influence how goods were transported across the American West for more than a century. Gideon Harker's response to that moment of frustration created something that thousands of men would rely on, that would carry millions of pounds of supplies across countless miles of mountain trails, and that would remain in use long after the world that created it had vanished. That's the measure of a successful innovation. Not whether it makes headlines or generates wealth, but whether it solves real problems reliably for people who need solutions. By that standard, Gideon Harker's crazy invention of a flexible leather pack saddle succeeded beyond measure. It changed how men traveled the frontier, not through dramatic revolution, but through steady, reliable performance that made difficult work slightly easier and dangerous work slightly safer. And for the men who used aparejos through decades of Western expansion, that was exactly the change they needed.